Well, good morning from Denver, Tom. How are you?
I'm doing well, Ellen. Great to see you.
Good. Yeah, it's good to see you as always. Thank you for agreeing to have this conversation today. I think as we're starting a new school year and there's so much, excitement and anticipation, around us. I was in the classroom yesterday morning and I said, what are your goals for your first graders this year? And she said, joy and agency. And I thought, yeah, how about having joy and agency as a goal? So I loved the way she's thinking about that. And so in that spirit, I want to think about, the goals that our colleagues may have with respect to engaging kids. And I have written in a blog recently that I really have some concerns about the level of engagement that I've seen, certainly post COVID, but we are long ago past post COVID. So I'm worried about kids. Seems to be lack of engagement in our classrooms. I'm concerned about children who don't feel safe and emotionally and socially safe, I guess, as well in their classrooms, and end up being described as behavior problems. Well,
Mhm.
no, they're children and they're not behaviors, right? And so I think that for us as teachers, particularly elementary and middle school teachers, there is a little bit of a dilemma because we are not trained as psychologists or social workers or therapists in and yet we run into these very intense kinds of emotional swings with kids, and I worry that that systems are sort of imposing on us to provide almost therapy-like conditions for kids. And I don't know. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology. I'm no more qualified to do that in a classroom than fly to the moon. So what seems to me is that the one thing we do know about that we can is sort of manipulate and manage in classrooms is the degree to which kids are academically engaged. Because in my observation, I'm sure this is true in yours, if kids are academically engaged, the issues around social and emotional well-being dissipate. There just isn't the intensity of these sort of kids feeling unsafe, I think is the best way to say it, and not just physically, but really emotionally and socially. So that feels to me like something that we teachers can do and do often in our classrooms. So I wanted to chat with you today about engagement, about how we can revisit engagement. I wrote a book about it in 2018. It's been a while, and then COVID's come in between. So how can we revisit what teachers can do legitimately in their classrooms to improve student engagement and therefore improve students' safety and well-being.
Great to talk about that. And I'm probably the great person to talk about engagement because when I was in school, I was never engaged. Um, I was one of those kids that was just there, and I was frankly, I was saved by standardized tests well,
Uh-oh.
because when it got to a standardized test, I could do okay. And so they said, "Don't worry about him. He's even though he's totally disengaged, he's okay." So that was me in school. So I'm probably a good person to maybe talk about disengagement, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder if we could go back to 2017 now, and what what was it that prompted you to write that book? I mean, why? What was going on in schools that you saw
Yeah.
caused the need for you to write that book?
Yeah. It goes back a lot before 2017. It's just that's when I started to get all my ideas together. But it really was in a sort of less intense degree. It really was disengagement. The way you're describing yourself as a kid, I could definitely describe myself that way, particularly in high school when there were boys to write notes to
Mhm.
instead.
Mhm.
And so there is that sort of we have a personal memory. I'm guessing most teachers do of what it feels like to be disengaged. But what I found in schools, going back to my own classroom, what I found is that I didn't know what to do about it. I could identify that they're disengaged, or at least that they look disengaged, because that's tricky too. I was, but how do I address it? What do I do? You can't say to a group of kids, "Okay, right now it's 10:03, get engaged." I mean, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So, what are the more subtle tools, perhaps, that we have, and what are the options that we have for getting kids engaged that are in no way punitive? And that really is, whether it's an incentive, putting marbles in the jar for kids who look engaged, or all of these sort of external incentives, I haven't found to be terribly effective. And Linda Gambrell's research would suggest very clearly that external incentives are not helpful. So what do you do? And so I started, as you remember, because you are my esteemed editor, esteemed and
Remember? I remember.
very patient editor, and I started by observing in a whole bunch of classrooms. I just watched kids when they were in the middle of instruction, whole group, small group, when they were doing independent work, and I followed up with some questions for those kids, of the kids that I was observing, to decide and to discern, I guess, whether during the observation they were indeed engaged or whether they just looked engaged. And I found huge, huge differences, and really thought back to my own, when I was in my classroom, how did I define engagement? Was it kids who were just looking like, yes, I'm here and I look like
Mhm.
I'm completely engaged, but I'm not, because
Mhm.
I was that kid. That
Mhm.
was the kid I was. I could look the part, baby. I could sit there and just look so engaged, but I was completely someplace else. And so
Mhm.
that's really what led me to this. What can teachers do? So I did these observations, and I came to some fairly broad conclusions that were pretty universal across the kids and classrooms and teachers I observed. And those became the four pillars of engagement that I talk about in the book. So it really was out of a practical necessity, and with careful observation. Sometimes I'd follow up with kids, and I'd say, they looked very engaged, and I'd ask them, and they'd say, no, thank you. I was elsewhere. I was doing the soccer, lineup in my head. So you really have to dig deep to figure out, I think, what they're really thinking and doing.
In the book, you distinguish between compliance and participation, which is kind of like, I think, kind of acting engaged, right?
Exactly.
And then you make a distinction that I wonder if you could talk about between motivation and engagement, and that's a little trickier, I think,
It
between
is. Yeah.
those two. Could you say something about that?
Sure. I mean, what I really found through these observations and just the research that I did was that there are a lot of kids who are compliant. Then one of teachers' sort of strategies to move them past compliance is to set up small group work, which participation, right? So everybody's in a small group. Theoretically, we're working on the same project, and I have some concerns about that I can go back to later. But then we have the situation that where there is sort of motivation and engagement. So many colleagues use those terms synonymously. I do not. So for motivation, I want to think about all of the things that our colleagues, teachers in the classroom, do every day to get kids excited about learning. So, for example, when a teacher is describing a book that he or she read and loved, and just, oh my gosh, I was turning the pages so quickly, I didn't go to sleep on time, and now I'm tired. That sort of enthusiastic sharing of one's own engagement experiences can be, and here's the distinction, motivating to kids. So I'm looking at motivation as something very positive, of course, but that comes externally to the learner. And then engagement is when that learner takes the baton and runs with it, and becomes more, well, agentive, right? They become more, have a feeling that I'm the kind of kid who can do this, which is, of course, a very engaging state to be in. You got to believe in your own capacity for learning more. So I think motivation often comes from a great soccer coach or from a, a religious teacher or from, and mostly for classroom teachers who really get kids excited. And there's a hugely important role for that, for teachers in that process. But we can't get them engaged. They have to get themselves engaged. And that's the distinction that I'm really making. And some of the strategies to move from motivated, excited kids to truly engaged kids.
And that leads to a question I had, and I'll kind of come by this in an indirect way. But if if, for example, a moose is walking down Mill Pond Road, which has happened,
I'm,
I
yeah,
missed it, but um, I'm engaged with that. I mean, if I were there to see it, there'd be no work on my part to be engaged with that. It's absolutely transfixing. Where's the moose going to go? That. You know.
yep,
Uh, but if I'm asked like to read something, I have to find my way to be engaged. There's some work, some activity that has to come from me to
yes,
be engaged. It
mm,
isn't just, an instant, electrical impulse. It's something I have to do. Could you
exactly.
talk about what it is that a reader has to do, a
Yeah,
writer, a learner has to do
yeah.
to be engaged?
Well, there are a number of ways to go at this, and you're absolutely right. Some things, the moose walking down the road is a great example. Some kids just, latch onto something. Often it's outside of school, unfortunately, and it's just we don't have to do anything. We just stand back, right? But there are kids then who, who may be engaged sort of automatically in some instances, but not in school. So if we're reading, let's taking your example of getting kids to read, the first thing they have to do is sustain attention long enough to find that they want to read it. And that's something that I think we can really work on as teachers. I am not talking, for example, about, okay, you guys read for 3 minutes today. Can you do four tomorrow? I'm not talking about that kind of way that we talk about stamina, but talking through, maybe it's a conference, maybe it's smaller whole group instruction, talking through with kids what it feels like, what it is like for us to in those early stages of deciding whether I'm going to catch hold of this book and want to follow it further. I think we've got to describe what that looks, sounds, feels, tastes, and smells like in order for kids to have an idea of what they need to do, because what they need to do is mostly cognitive and emotional for sure. But obviously, you've got to stick with the book long enough to get to that. So I'm arguing, I guess, that we have regular, not long, but just regular conversations in all three sort of configurations, whole group, small group, conference, with kids to really talk directly about what it feels like for them. And importantly, when they are disengaged, how do they re-engage? Right. So
Mhm.
that's something I talk about in the book as well. But it is, and there are some really great techniques for just getting kids to be aware of their engagement in the first place, because they're not now. And then to move toward, oops, I lost my focus. Nobody can be focused and engaged all the time. The brain needs
No, well,
breaks, right?
yeah.
So how, once you have slipped out of that engagement, how do you get going again?
When I was thinking about this question, what do we need to do to become engaged? What I what occurred to me was a lot of the comprehension strategies you talk about for reading apply more broadly.
Very
And
much so. Yeah.
uh, and when I think about what I need to do when I'm engaged doing something and trying to get into the project, it's a lot of those comprehension strategies that I'm really operating on. I wonder if you just react to that, or is that just
Yeah.
really weird?
No, it's not really weird at all. It's exactly where we want to be with kids. Can we work on engagement without teaching comprehension strategies? Sure. I just think it's a tremendous support, as you're saying, because those strategies, we first think aloud and show kids the cognitive moves that it really takes a learner, could be reading a book, could be writing, could be doing a science lab, what are the cognitive moves that it takes to get to the point where we are understanding and therefore engaging? If you're reading a book and you have very superficial comprehension, are you going to be excited about sustaining it,
Uh-huh.
engaging in it? Probably not. So those strategies are really tools in order to help kids just get a foothold in a book, but also to monitor their comprehension, to be aware of, I'm understanding or I'm not understanding right now. That's critical. We talk about the umbrella concept of metacognition, being aware of one's own thinking. The comprehension strategies are metacognitive strategies. The engagement strategies are also metacognitive strategies. So a lot of this is bringing to kids sort of their conscious thought, wow, am I engaged or not? What can I do about it? Because learning is a whole lot more fun when they're engaged.
And to me, it's like one of the strategies of curiosity. Like asking questions. Okay,
Yeah,
what does this? This I read this opening. What am I curious about? What am I going to predict? What's going to happen? It seems to me that
exactly.
there's a real
Very
connection.
tight connection. Very, very tight connection. And, thank goodness, because that really makes our way a lot easier. We talk about, young kids, and some people have concerns about littles, Ks, ones and twos. Can they really be metacognitive or developmentally? Is that not working? We have found really, I can almost say without exception, that young kids are actually more susceptible to or more open to learning these cognitive strategies. They love to be in the big word club. So I routinely taught this yesterday morning in first grade. Teach the word metacognition. Can they get to a point where they understand it? Of course they can. It's not overnight, but of course they can. So I think the more we can do with metacognitive strategies, including comprehension strategies, the better our press toward engagement, away from just us motivating to their engagement. Engagement lasts longer too. I should have said that when you asked the question before, right? Motivation might be something that a kid feels when you are sharing a book, and then after lunch it's gone.
Uh-huh.
But engagement, true engagement lasts. And there's, obviously no set time, but it lasts. And that's one of the exciting things I think about teaching kids to do this.
I want to shift now, maybe to now, because you wrote this book in
18.
2016, came out in
Yeah.
2017, and you've said that you think it's more relevant now, and the idea of is more relevant now, post-COVID, given the climate now. Could you say something of why you think that's the case?
Yeah, I wish I knew, Tom. I wish I had the answer to that. As I said in the opening, we're just seeing so many kids who are suffering emotionally and socially, and the resultant behaviors are causing difficulties for teachers,
Mhm.
right? But what's behind those difficulties? What's underneath that? Why are kids feeling like that? And I wish I could be more articulate about this, but since COVID, the intensity of those experiences, kids, not regulating themselves in classrooms, impulse control problems, since the pandemic, those have definitely worsened. I'm talking to principals in my client schools that say they spend 80% of the week on discipline. Now, there's something wrong with that, right? And that's not what we want principals to be doing. We want them to provide instructional leadership, but it's taking up a huge amount of time for principals. If there is a building psychologist, social worker, usually they have 5 or 6 buildings, and of course the teachers. So I don't know why this is lasting as long as it is, but I think, the home school student connection is really troubled right now in many, many schools. So what can we do about it as teachers? We're we're not therapists, but we can get kids engaged at school.
And engagement is a healthy feeling. I mean, it's a feeling of,
It's
when you're,
intoxicating.
yeah, it's like, and I think learning something is an intoxicating feeling, that it makes no,
Exactly.
you know, when you
Give me
solve a
more.
problem, if I solve a problem on my computer, I mean, I could just feel my whole body just almost feel better,
Totally. Yeah.
you just
Yeah.
feel better. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if we could freeze what you just said, Tom, and put that just that few minutes when you said that into a classroom, the results would be immediate and impressive. Now we have to continue to do that, but I think you describing physically even what it feels like and cognitively, even emotionally, when you describe that, that's exactly what we want teachers to do in the classroom, to open that conversation, to what is engaging to them, so that kids are on the lookout. Oh my gosh, I feel sort of like Dr. Newkirk did when he was at the computer and his whole body, right? That's we're going for that. But how do they know, Tom? I mean, in no standards or curriculum document, is there anything that suggests that we can help kids self-engage and re-engage? So that's what this is about. Actually looking forward to recording Engaging Children as an audiobook, and I think that will, but I'm making some pretty substantial revisions in it, again, because our context is so different after the pandemic.
Do you think a lot of these kids know what engagement is, but they know it because of some outside activity? They know it because of how they play soccer. They know it because of ballet class. They know it because of, uh,
Video
they
game.
love to sing. They know it because of it. They know what it is.
Yeah,
But
they do. It's just, oh, sorry.
school doesn't get it sometimes. It
Doesn't.
doesn't
It doesn't.
elicit it. It doesn't
Yeah.
foster it.
Or it's accidental, we could all describe, many times of interacting with students where we had no idea that they were so engaged in something. And
Mm.
then, when we find out, then our job is really to clear the path so that they can continue, as you mentioned a second ago, to follow that engagement. I have a colleague, Sherry Kilpatrick in Michigan, West Michigan, and she kind of stumbled on this. But when one of her kids got super engaged about a topic, a nonfiction book that they were reading, she had the wisdom to pick up on his mostly nonverbal signals and to say to the child, okay, you're interested? Go. Right now, go. And all she did was make sure that he it was a boy in this case, had materials that were going to support his inquiry. And she set up these mini inquiries because she realized how important choice is. I mean, if we're telling kids what to inquire into, we're going to lose some of the potency and some of the engagement. Choice is hugely important here, as it is, as you and I have read and discussed for many, many years, something that our colleague, your close friend Don Graves, really unearthed the power of choice in thinking about, about writers, but it's also true for scientists and readers. Makes me think, Tom, you had a lot of university students going through your through your classrooms over the years, before you retired. What did you notice with older kids and their engagement? I mean, you did a lot of writing with them, yeah?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think what I noticed, and it's nothing radical or anything, is the more you knew about them, the more you could craft, encourage writing that they would become engaged with. Um, there's
Exactly.
one story, I think I've told it before. I know I've told it before. I had this one student in an advanced writing class, and she was really floundering, and she had this paper that she wrote about her hometown, and it was just facts, none of which were very interesting. And
Oh,
she had this postcard, and I looked at the postcard, and it was, Norman Rockwell's picture of Rosie the Riveter,
yeah.
the iconic picture of Rosie the
Very
Riveter.
easy to visualize that.
Everybody knows that picture, knows that painting. And I said, "Oh, you got Rosie the Riveter?" And she says, "Yeah, that was my mom." And I said, "That was your mom?" And she says, "Yeah, my mom. She was like 19, and she was the model for
Wow.
Rosie the Riveter." And I said, hmm. And she says, and I just stopped, stunned. And she says, yeah, my whole town was painted by Norman Rockwell. We're in all these, uh, Saturday Evening Post paintings.
Yeah.
I said, I think we have a topic here.
I think we have a really good topic here.
And it
That's
was luck, it was
amazing.
lucky, but it was like I was kind of channeling my mother, who's like would always be curious about other people, and so I asked about the postcard,
Yeah.
and so I think, long story short, I think that it's like knowing something about the life experiences,
Yeah.
the major, of the students, and then building a lot of literacy, building reading, I mean,
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
was a sports fan, you give me a sports book, I was going to read it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then I got to read other things, but that was my way in. So,
Yeah.
um,
But it's
I
knowing
think,
it's knowing your
no,
kids, your students.
knowing, I mean, it sounds so obvious, but knowing your students and knowing enough about options that can be built around those interests, that so that their primary interests are kind of like fostered and encouraged and
Yeah.
by what they read. Um,
Yeah.
so that's what
It's a
I would say.
That's a great example because that also had choice in it,
Yeah,
right? I mean, she pivoted on the choice with your guidance,
yeah,
but she was not she wasn't told, to write a 5 paragraph essay about her summer vacation, I assume, and those sort of tired, things that we really shouldn't be asking writers to do. She
yeah,
had choice,
yeah,
she had support from you,
yeah,
and you helped her find the beating heart of the piece.
yeah, yeah,
I think that's it. I find that true with kids a lot, that it's, younger kids. We went to Worlds of Fun and then, and it goes on for pages. And then there's something really amazing at the end. I was conferring with a kiddo in Missouri several years ago, and he had one of those this happened and then this happened and then this happened kinds of stories. And I mean, it went on and on and on. And at the end, he said, and that was a really special day for me and my dad because he went to prison the next day.
wow,
Okay.
wow,
So, meanwhile, we have long descriptions of every ride they rode, which was sort of exhausting for him to write. And at
mm,
the end, there's that nugget.
mm.
I'm not going to force him to write about it, but there's something with a real beating heart.
And even those long things, I've become patient with those because we think this is really boring, right? Talk about engagement.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is really boring. But
Good
that
point.
kid was interested enough in that day to write all that.
Yep.
So so it isn't like, so we might have been engaged by one thing, but he's engaged by that whole day that he spent with his dad, right? And
You're
so
so right. And I
we have
really
to be
haven't thought
patient.
about this.
We have to be patient with some of that writing that may not be totally interesting to me. And I think with voice writing, often it can be one episode after another,
Yeah.
and
Event.
and then and I think they probably need to write all that.
That is so interesting, and I have to admit, I have never thought about it that way. Remember, I think Mary Ellen Jacoby called those bed to bed stories where you
Yeah,
wrote about every single thing.
yeah, yeah,
Very common among our second and third graders and some
yeah,
fourth graders.
yeah,
But I love that perspective that, there's no question that this little guy was engaged while he was writing that. I mean, I wasn't there for the whole thing, but
yeah,
if you've got 9 pages, something is compelling you to keep going, and you're in third or fourth grade. I think he was in fourth grade.
yeah.
So yeah,
And I say
and that
go
makes
for it, go for it, and
absolutely
then
right.
maybe revise it, take a part out of, but I think that
Exactly. Yeah.
that volume, and I think, volume and engagement, I think, are connected too, because if
Very
you're just
much so.
reading a ton of stuff, but it may not be the greatest literature, you're learning a lot of things,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
volume
What
and
we would
writing
fondly
is
call
something.
beach reads.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
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 Because I think it's how many millions of words you read, because you internalize patterns, you develop vocabulary, and you can develop that with
Grammar.
literature that's not great, I think,
Yeah.
right?
I agree. I think that's really important to keep in mind. So
Right.
yeah, thank you.
So I'm wondering, because you're nearing kind of the end, I'm wondering if, now at the beginning of the school year, people are into it, maybe certainly the first month. What would be your one bit of advice to teachers that the one thing that you could suggest to, for them to really pay attention to so that they could engage their students
Yeah,
and help their engage their students and help their students develop that kind of self-engagement that you're talking
exactly.
about?
Yeah. Honestly, it's going to be very simple. 3-word response. Oh, I guess 4 words. Tell them your stories. Tell them what engages you. Just in large group, small group, doesn't matter. Large group is fun because then you get the kids to play off of each other. You
Mhm.
start to tell them what engages you and how it feels in every way, intellectually, emotionally, and so on. That's where it starts. And I think we're always looking for, well, what else should I do? Just do that at the beginning. Now, in engaging children, I suggest that we talk about 4 different pillars of engagement, and I think that's good going forward later in the school year. But right now, that's what I would be doing. Tom, you know that I have a sort of wild obsession with aviation, commercial aviation. So when I go into a classroom that we're talking about engagement, very often I'll start by telling the kids about how much I love to fly and how it provides both intellectual sort of engagement for me because I'm constantly learning new things about, what keeps airplanes in the air, but it's also emotional. I mean, think about the emotions associated with both, good and bad associated with flying. For me, they're huge. And then, the third pillar is a sense of the aesthetic. So what's beautiful to you? I was flying across the country last week, looking down at these clouds that were sort of Georgia O'Keeffe paintings, and just thinking, wow, that sky is never gonna look like that, again. And it's just it was beautiful, right? And so I think we start to tell them about our engagement as detailed as we can, right? And then let them when I'm talking about flying, they always pick up. I mean, I've got hands up before I finish the first sentence. They know, but you were triggering their memory. And I think the other sort of word to the wise, very much related to your ideas about the bed to bed stories. Word to the wise is that a lot of the kids that you have will say Minecraft, will say video games, that's the thing that engages them the most. And I think we teachers need to be very sympathetic to that. We need to avoid dismissing it out of hand because I think we're concerned about how much time kids spend in front of screens, but this is not your time to proselytize on that.
Uh-huh.
Accept everything and then start to pull out, oh my gosh, there was a learning component to that. There was an emotional component to that. So we're just sort of slowly incorporating and eventually naming the 4 pillars in what they are, what their stories are. So it's a pretty simple start. The tricky part is that we have to remember to do it. And we don't always remember to do it, right? So it's not a curriculum, it's not a series of lessons. It's just wondering with kids side by side, what is it that engaged me this much in in whatever topic we're talking about?
I remember I had teachers in high school, history teachers, who just loved the Civil War.
Yeah.
They've been to the battlefields, um, and we spent so much time on the Civil War that we never made it to the 20th century, let alone, well,
Yeah.
was the
Yeah.
21st century back then.
Yeah.
But we never made it to World War One, and I think what I remember is this guy just being crazy about the Civil War, what it was like to be totally obsessed by the
Yeah.
details of Chickamauga, and I don't remember where Chickamauga was, but I remember him being obsessed by that. And I
And
think
that's lasted,
that's
you're
lasted,
yeah, you're in your late 40s, early 50s.
at least,
And
yeah,
so that's lasted a long time,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so those are the teachers, of course, that stand out for all of us. That passion, and we often talk about helping kids develop their passion for different things. They can't do that without a model, right?
Mhm.
And so your history teacher was a model. We now need to take up that challenge and be the models of engagement we want our kids to emulate.
Well, great talking to you, Ellen, about this
You
tremendously
as
important
well,
topic.
Tom. It's always a pleasure, and I always learn lots and lots of new things. And for anyone watching this, we'll try to get Tom back and continue this discussion and include a couple of teachers who have done a lot of work in this area. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ellen.